Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our keynote in today's International Symposium. And we're very fortunate to have with us for our keynote address Ambassador Guajardo. And so I'd like to do a couple of introductions and then turn this over to our keynote. So Ambassador Guajardo is currently a senior director at McLarty Associates. However, he served as ambassador under two Mexican presidents, both to China from 2007 to 2013. While he was in China, Ambassador Guajardo visited every Chinese province and established really close relationships with provincial authorities, as well as with key figures in the Chinese business and in the financial sectors. Not just Chinese experience, though. Guajardo also served as consul general for Mexico in Austin, Texas, from 2005 to 2007. Ambassador Guajardo holds a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and a Master's in Public Policy from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He's been involved in presidential campaign and electoral politics in Mexico, but he continues to live in Washington, D.C., traveling often to Mexico and China. And thank you for being with us today, Ambassador Guajardo.
Thank you.
I also have with us today journalist Julian Aguilar. Julian reports on politics and border affairs from the Texas-Mexico border. His focuses have included immigration reform, enforcement, voter ID, international trade, border security, and the drug trade. His political coverage has included local legislative and congressional races in Texas, as well as local and national elections in Mexico. Before joining the Texas Tribune, he was a freelance writer for Fort Worth Weekly, a government and crime reporter for the Laredo Morning Times, and a political writer for the Rio Grande Guardian. So thank you for being with us, Julian Aguilar, as well. And I will leave this in your capable hands to have a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Good afternoon. And before we get started, thanks again for having me back virtually this time. But it's always a great pleasure to hear from you folks and to be asked to be part of these important conversations. So thank you very much. A lot to cover. Talk about China and Mexico, which we could do 2 days and instead of an hour. But we'll get going. On this discussion. It's a very important discussion. So Ambassador, when we spoke, it was a few weeks ago in preparation. You talked about the 21st century Cold War, so to speak, and which China is gonna play a major part. I'm a Generation X guy, so I remember the previous Cold War with the former Soviet Union when the wall came down and glasnosts and things. And in history books, the Cold War teaches us about Cuban Missile Crisis and the standoff and these very dramatic and sort of scary images. But you were telling us a few weeks ago that this is a whole new ball game and it's mainly technology based. So I'll just start off with that with respect to how much. Well, I guess the first question is China a threat to the United States and the rest of the world, given how much it's in the news right now about its certain practices with online information distribution and just certain things like that. I mean, I think it's fair to note that the United States is still a major trade partner with China, so there's also economics involved. But I know it's a general question, but if you could just sort of speak to how big of a threat is China, and is that a material physical threat? Is it a technological threat? Is it a combination of both, and why?
So thank you, Julian. So I think that's a great question to start this conversation. And I would start by saying, yes, China is an adversary. China, make no mistake, China is an adversary. I'm not sure I'd qualify it as a threat, but probably as close as you get to it. Why do I say that? So we talked about the Cold War. You just started talking about the Cold War. I grew up during the Cold War, and the Cold War was an easy way for people to see things, geopolitics back then. There was good versus evil. There was the good side, which was the United States. There was a bad side, which were the Russians. You had movies built around this. You remember Rocky 2 or 3. I remember, where the Russian felt no pain, whereas Rocky was just a common guy, you know, calling his wife Adrian. And it was all framed in that sense, good versus bad. There was this other movie called America, which would be what with K, what would the United States look like under communism? So it was easy to instill fear and purpose on the American people to stand up for the challenge, whatever that would be, or however you would face that challenge against the Soviet Union. Then we have a long period of pretty much unipolarity, where the United States is the sole superpower in the world. And all of a sudden, here comes China with a completely different scenario than you would see with the Soviet Union, because China is not an expansionist country. China does not seek to overthrow governments or to instill an ideological way of government. Yeah. Nevertheless, it's an economic superpower. It's now the second biggest economy in the world, and it's one that we have now learned will use its economic power to instill its influence in the world. And that makes it very troublesome and very, very worrisome to me. And I was telling you that right now, China is the biggest threat to the Western liberal order. What do I mean by Western liberal order? Human rights, free speech, freedom of academia, all those things we take for granted, China now threatens, and it'll use its market to threaten these concepts. And I'll start just by putting the example of Australia. Australia, a country that has never, or most of us have never thought of Australia as a battleground of anything. It's, you know, it's a friendly country. It's there, you know, the Aussies, they play rugby. But we never thought much of Australia as a country that faced any peril or challenge ideologically or geopolitically. Through the years, as China was growing, Australia started exporting more and more to China to the point that now 40% of its exports go to China, becoming by far its biggest export market. And all of a sudden along comes COVID, and Australia just does what most countries do, which is to say, hey, we should examine or investigate where this came from. And China takes offense. And China says, no, you can't say that. You can't ask for this investigation. And Australia all of a sudden says, well, you know, the Chinese community in Australia is sort of putting more pressure on us than we are comfortable with. So we want to push back. And China takes offense and says, okay, if that's how you're going to act, we're going to stop all imports from Australia. And overnight, you have China stopping all imports of Australian beef, of Australian wine, all these industries that employ a lot of Australians that have no other outlet. And China says, if you want to take things back to the way they were before, here are 14 points you have to follow. Among those 14 points are, one, your press cannot criticize China. Your academia cannot investigate China. So this is the first case, or the most salient case, of all of a sudden you say, oh, wow, China is using its economic power to try to put a lid on press freedom on a third country, on a country that we never suspected would face these pressures, such as Australia. Then it does the same to Canada. It does the same to Sweden. So that's why I say China is a country that we should be very careful of, because they will never hesitate to use its economic power to threaten our sovereignty and to put a lid on freedoms we take for granted. That's something we should keep in mind when we think of China.
Is this reaction from China, is it like in the case of Australia, you know, Australia said, wait a minute, we're going to look at some things, and China said, okay, if you're going to do that, we're going to, you know, enforce these 14 points. Had Australia not said anything, would China have done that? I mean, so is it reactionary? Is it somebody has to poke the bear with a stick before they feel this wrath?
Sort of, yes, but they lay it on thick. So they had done it before to the Philippines, when the Philippines tried to protect its island chain from Chinese excursion. They stopped imports of Philippine bananas. They did it to Norway, when Norway, or the Nobel Committee, which only on the Peace Prize turns out to be issued out of Norway. The rest of the Nobel Prizes are out of Sweden, but the Peace Prize is out of Norway, and the Peace Prize Academy issued the Nobel Prize to Liu Xiaobo, a Chinese dissident. And again, China reacts the same way. They stopped all imports from Norway salmon. They stopped all investment in Norway. And you start seeing cases in different countries in which China is very directly using its economic power to threaten liberties that we took for granted.
Okay.
So yes,
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, so we see it in Australia, and if you will, Australia had to poke, but it wasn't much of a poke. It was just raising an issue.
Okay.
So that's what makes it worrisome.
So if there's another country that's raising an issue, not necessarily acting on it, China can always say, "Hey, look what we did to these other countries," as kind of this is a warning to you guys not to go that far.
That's exactly what they're doing. They're setting examples with all these countries and saying, this is what happens to you if you mess with us. And then they do this other, but they don't do it just out of thin air. I mean, they don't all of a sudden come and say, whoa, you mess with us, so we're going to block you. They start getting into your head. And here's an example, a current example that you can pay attention and start seeing around the world as we see the COVID vaccine rollout. So several countries have developed COVID vaccines, notably the US, UK, Germany, Russia, China. China is using its vaccine for diplomatic purposes. So one of the things you see when China sends shipments of its vaccine, it demands from the recipient government to come out and publicly thank the Chinese government and people for that shipment of vaccines. So you saw, or I saw 2 days ago, the Mexican foreign minister put out a tweet and a statement saying, we thank the people and the government of the brotherly state of China for this vaccine shipment. A statement that I have not seen him make for shipments of vaccines coming from the UK or from Germany.
Okay.
So this is the first step in, well, sure, what can go wrong? We're just thanking them. We need the vaccines. The next step is maybe the Chinese will say, maybe you want to tell your press not to refer to Taiwan as an independent country. Maybe you want to tell them that your country subscribes to the one China policy. And of course, as a foreign ministry, you say, actually, that is true. I have no objection to that. I will let my journalists know or put out that we subscribe to the one China policy and that they should not refer to Taiwan as an independent country. Mind you, that's a call the press makes, not a government makes, how you refer to a country. And they start creeping up to the point that before you know it, they will say, well, such and such journalist is questioning this and this action by China. And maybe you want to tell them they don't want to do that, to the point that a country eventually says, actually, we cannot do this because in our country, the freedom of speech and the freedom of press is a sacred right. Oh, so you can't. Well, that's where when you start noticing these repercussions or issues that China. So that's how it creeps. It's silently, and before you know it, it's there, and it's very threatening. It's very threatening to freedoms that we take for granted. So.
In the introduction, I mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis example of the Cold War that we might still be familiar with as far as like the images that pop into our head, right? But Cuba is a curious example because under Obama, when he was trying to reopen ties with Cuba, there was a lot of criticism about it's an oppressive regime and examples about stifling freedom of the press and just the way they treat their population. That when Obama was trying to do that, there were a lot of arguments saying, well, look at the way the Saudis treat, the women in that country. Look at the way the Chinese treat, but it was always somewhat muted. But now you're seeing a lot more criticism, open criticism of the Chinese government especially from Republicans, from Trump-style Republicans in the United States. What was it? Was it the coronavirus that was the main impetus for this criticism, or had this been brewing because China's always been, like you said, deemed an adversary, but because of trade and economic issues, you were always kind of hush-hush about it unless you had to say something. So when did this change become that all of a sudden China is openly an adversary or even a threat, depending on who you ask?
I think it changed in the 2008 financial crisis. Okay. And that was the point in which China made a psychological switch in which they said the US is a country in decline. And it's our role now to be the rising power. And to this point, they are fully absolutely convinced without a doubt that the United States is a country in decline and that they are the new masters in the world. So after 2008, they started saying, like, we have nothing to learn from the United States and we don't have to abide by the rules of the multilateral world or the Western-led order. We can impose our own rules. So you started seeing them impinging on other rights. First came the South China Sea, in which they started claiming land for themselves that did not belong to them, and the UN Convention on Law of the Seas rule did not belong to them, but they no longer feared the repercussions from the United States, which they saw in decline. Then you saw things like Hong Kong, which they had signed a treaty, a UN sanctioned treaty with UK, saying that for 50 years they would maintain two countries, one system. That is to say, they would allow the independence of Hong Kong to act as an independent entity with its own judiciary system, its own legislative system. And then all of a sudden, last year, President Xi Jinping says, nah, we'll just take over. And I mean, forget the treaty we made. And you see these certain debates, and along comes Xinjiang and the treatment of Uyghurs, in which, again, before China used to be more subdued, more attuned to international world opinion. And all of a sudden they say, no, we are the masters of the world. We no longer have to abide by anyone else's conception of us. So that's where they start switching and changing. And that's what brings us to this point in which all of a sudden you see a China almost going rogue. And you say, well, when did this happen? It started in 2008. And that's when they were fully convinced that the US was a country in decline and that they were the new masters in the world.
With these countries that China can exert pressure on, what works better for China? Pressure on stifling what we in the United States know as the First Amendment and freedom of speech and getting information that is impartial and important out there, or the economic sanctions that could very well, trickle down to other parts of the country. I mean, I'll throw my bias in here as a journalist. I know which I think is more important, but which levers does China pull, or does it depend on the country?
So no, I think that's a great question. And that's why it's very important. That's why the threat is so big. So again, we go back to Australia. And all of a sudden, Australia bans all imports of Australian wine, coal, meat. And before you know it, you have hundreds of thousands of Australians out of a job. And Australia says, you can get your job back, you can get your market back, if only you get your press to shut up about us. And that's when you start realizing, well, how do you explain to the farmer, and how do you explain to the coal miner or the meat producer that they're out of a job because you're defending freedom of speech or the press to criticize the Chinese? How long before the farmer says, so just stop criticizing them? And boom, they have a win that emboldens them and they take to another country. So that's what makes it so dangerous. And that's why I think the world, or President Biden has been talking about a coalition of democracies to stand up to China precisely against these threats. Ideally, it's not easy to implement. I mean, it's easy to talk about it, but ideally the world would stand up in a NATO way in which an attack on one means an attack on all, and say, if you block these countries' imports, we will block our exports to China. Unfortunately, the Chinese market is so big, it's the only economy that is growing, that again, it's hard to bring countries on board, or societies, let alone countries, societies on board to punish the Chinese for their excesses. And you see the most salient case right now is Germany. Germany, a country that has been, has done a lot of soul searching over its past and has amended its way, and they own it and they don't hide it. And yet now you see Germany reaching an investment treaty with China, despite all the excesses and abuses we are witnessing in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, which are not much unlike what they experienced in Germany in due time. And you'd figure Germany would be the first country to say, we recognize this and we will not abide by it. But turns out that China is the biggest market for Volkswagen. Right. So, well, we're against these things, but it's my exports, it's my workers. And how do I tell my workers that they will not get their jobs or their exports because we're standing up? So they don't stand on principle and they abide these things. That's what makes it very dangerous. And that's why we should all be on the lookout for these things.
Okay. Yeah, and sort of the worldwide perception of the media across the board, and the low approval rate, so to speak, I guess that might also kind of tip the balance on, the cost benefit analysis when they're trying to weigh freedom of speech versus the economic effects. Lastly, on China, before we move on to Mexico, so just this morning in preparation, I just quick Google search to see the most recent headlines about the United States and the Chinese relationship. So Slate, considered more of a progressive outlet, says Biden wants to take China and climate change on at the same time. Sort of this is the agenda, putting climate change and China both on the same scale. USA Today says fact check about Biden giving China access to the power grid. I mean, these are conspiracy theories that are going to kind of keep going out there. And another one from Business Insider says 4 in 10 American voters say that Biden is not being tough enough on China. And before actually we came on this broadcast, this panel discussion about an hour before, Senator Ted Cruz, U.S. Senator Ted Cruz's office released a statement saying that he voted against the Biden's ambassador to the United Nations because it's perceived that she's too soft on China so far, right? So would you want to be President Biden and having to deal with China right now? I mean, what is his path forward to try to assess these two major situations you and I just discussed, but everything else that has to do with the U.S. and China?
So, no, I think President Biden is very clear-eyed on China. And as they say, if personnel is policy, his team, his China team, is very wide-eyed on the China threat. So I am very confident that President Biden knows what he's facing or what the United States is facing when it comes to China and has the right team in place. Now, there's a lot of performative politics when it comes to China because that's probably the only issue in which there is bipartisan in Washington right now. Both sides agree that China is a threat. And that's why you see a lot of posturing. You see a lot of posturing saying, I'm going to be tougher than the other guy because I know these cells and I don't want to be outflanked. In most other issues, each one has their own side. The Democrats may be for climate or measures against climate change, the Republicans not. I mean, most issues there are wide divergence. On China, they're both trying to outflank each other to see who is tougher on China. One, because again, Julian, going back to the Cold War, it's easy to rally a country against a foreign adversary. And for a very long time, the United States, I mean, sure, you had the war on terrorism,
right.
but there's no face to terrorism. I mean, there was maybe Bin Laden, but he was in hiding. He was not out there. So it's very appealing to have an enemy to stand up to the way the Chinese becomes an enemy. So that's why you see performative politics by Senator Ted Cruz on China. Now, what the nominee to be UN ambassador, what she said was that China was making inroads in Africa, which they are, by the way. And what she said was that, in fact, China was doing good things. My guess, and I do not know her personally, my guess is she was trying to get the United States out of its America First blindness and say, the other guys are making inroads where we are focused just on the America First, trying to go it alone. And now it's been misconstrued as her lauding or applauding China, which I don't think she was. I find it hard to believe that anybody would. But that's why you see this performative politics and saying they're all trying to outflank each other to see who's tougher in China.
Right. Yeah, and there's also obviously a very partisan divide in the U.S. Nominations process, so we can attribute some of that. And Linda Thomas Greenfield, I'm sorry, I didn't use her by name, but that's who we're talking about with respect to the nominees. So moving on to Mexico, which I can see from where I'm sitting right now here in El Paso, Texas. We spoke earlier, AMLO, President López Obrador, he took his time to congratulate then President-elect Biden. And it was, he said the right thing. Like, well, I'm not going to get involved. They still have a debate. I want to wait till it's official. But the sort of undertones of that was, well, he doesn't want to upset the then current president, for the last month or so, which was then President Trump. So let's talk Mexico. And I'll start off with the first question on this. That was the last question on the China topic. How does Biden move forward with Mexico? We're El Paso, Texas, the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, Del Rio, some other places have been hit disproportionately with the border restrictions, with the immigration issue. So moving forward, let's just jump to immigration. First of all, how much of this immigration change under Biden is going to be pegged as a national security issue by the Republicans, and how is that going to affect the U.S.-Mexico relationship?
Well, immigration is an issue like gun control, in which a majority of the country supports immigration, just like they support gun control. Unfortunately, those who oppose it tend to come out and vote more. So it's an issue in which, particularly the Republican Party has adopted a hard line, and there is no political argument for them to change that. But immigration is an issue. I mean, it's here. There are, by some accounts, 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States that are here. I mean, you cannot look away from the fact that they are here. So whether the country addresses them is a matter more of civil rights than international relations. That is to say, it's almost like going back to slavery. It's just having an underclass for economic exploitation, and whether you give them equal rights or not. That's the way I see it. Now, traditionally, Mexico has taken a strong issue in defense of Mexicans who are the big majority of undocumented immigrants in the United States. President López Obrador has not done so. One, because he doesn't care about anything that happens outside of Mexico. He doesn't care about anyone that doesn't directly come out and vote for him. So he has not been as proactive in defending immigrant rights in the United States or Mexicans' rights in the United States as other presidents have been. In that sense, he has sort of sided with the Trump administration of sort of blocking, sending out the army to block immigration in coming to the United States. And in that sense, and I'm gonna sidestep a little bit here, because the big question is, why did López Obrador find it so easy to get along with President Trump?
Right. He's considered far left, and Trump obviously is now considered far right. So it's an odd.
Also,
right.
Also, he's Mexican, and Trump hates Mexicans. So you'd figure, you'd figure that'd be enough of a reason to say we don't like each other.
Right.
But there is a reason why not only President López Obrador, but President Bolsonaro of Brazil, President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador, and you have all these Latin Americans who all of a sudden felt very comfortable with President Trump. And there's a reason, there's a dichotomy of the way the United States is perceived around the world. You have the European countries who witnessed the United States as a savior during World War II. The United States came in by invitation of the European countries to come in, by UK in particular, and Winston Churchill, to come and help them ward off the threat of Germany. So the United States is a savior. That has not been the experience in Latin America. In Latin America, there has never been an invitation for the United States. It's always been an interventionist in the United States. It's always been invasions or meddling in politics. So, and then after probably the Carter administration, there was a focus on democracy and human rights and all these issues that Latin American governments find very uncomfortable for the United States to meddle, if you will, or in. And along comes a President Trump, and he just provides perfect fodder for all these Latin American leaders. And he says, I'm not going to deal with you. I don't care if you're corrupt. I don't care if you're anti-democratic. I don't care if you don't respect human rights. I don't care. I just don't want your people in my country. So that's a very comfortable position for all these presidents in Latin America who say, so you don't care if I do away with all democratic institutions with free press as they did in El Salvador, if I send the army to Congress, you don't care about any of that. No, I'm fine with it. Oh, great. I can get along with that. So they find it very easy to cohabitate with him. And along comes a President Biden who is more traditional. And what are issues? So he just issued a big speech last week on foreign policy. He said his foreign policy was going to be based on democracy. Well, all of a sudden, that's uncomfortable for President Lopez Obrador, who's been very comfortable, threatening all the democratic institutions. President Biden says, and also, by the way, on climate change. Oh, well, that's also very uncomfortable for President Lopez Obrador, who's trying to do away with clean energies and go back to carbon-fueled electricity. And all of a sudden, he comes and says, in free speech or the press is not the enemy. Oh, is it though? And that starts making Latin American governments very uncomfortable. Now, did a President Biden say or do anything to threaten them directly? No, it's just that they know that he stands for values the United States has traditionally stood for, that they find threatening to their persons, not to their countries. So again, going back, the thing about Trump and Lopez Obrador was that Trump criticized Mexicans, but he never criticized Lopez Obrador. The thing of a President Biden is that he may criticize Lopez Obrador, not that he has, but he may criticize President Lopez Obrador, but not Mexicans. Okay. That's problematic for Lopez Obrador. So that's why you see sort of a divergence between Mexico and the United States, and Mexico sort of doing all this pushback, gratuitous pushback on the United States. Like they wouldn't recognize he won. They wouldn't congratulate him after his victory. Then Mexico says they're going to offer asylum to Assange. Like all these things, like where is that coming from? I think it's the United States trying to put distance with, Mexico trying to put distance with the United States.
But Trump did threaten to close the border, which would cripple speaking as a Texan, would cripple our economy with respect to the trade value. But the assembly line going up to auto parts in Michigan and textile plants in the Carolinas or whatever, so Trump did do that. And when he did threaten to do that on the immigration issue, that's when you saw Lopez Obrador say, okay, well, I'm gonna start sending more people to the southern border. So what if President Biden did the same thing? What if in 6 months from now we see another increase in the folks that are coming through Mexico? Could Biden say, look, I'm gonna make similar threats that Trump did and you back down? Or would Lopez Obrador, just because it's not Trump and Biden, would he just say, nah, let them through, it's not my problem, they're going to the United States?
So first, unfortunately, the search is already happening. So that's troublesome, problematic, something to keep an eye on, and hopefully we find a way to control it. Second, I don't think President Biden has it in himself to take this type of measures, this type of unilateralism, America First measures. But even if he did, it would now be very convenient for President Lopez Obrador, just for the simple reason that Mexico's economy has contracted by 10%. Probably is one of the worst countries in handling the pandemic around the world. And President Lopez Obrador comes from a school, which is the old PRI, that has always found it very useful to blame everything that goes wrong in the United States, los gringos. So at this point, where we stand, if a President Biden were to close or implement any of the measures that President Trump threatened with, it would be a welcome gift for President Lopez Obrador, because he would say, you see, we're trying to do things well, but the Americans, they want to screw us, they want to subjugate us. That's the story. That's the history of our people, is always subjugation from the United States. So that plays into his DNA. That's how he thinks. That's how he acts. I don't think that'll happen, though. I don't think President Biden will threaten with closing the border just because it was such a Trump-branded issue.
Okay. And with respect to just global and national security, I've been writing. I've probably written 3 or 4 stories in the 10 years, 11 years I've been at the Tribune about concerns that the U.S.-Mexico border is susceptible to terrorist organizations, right? We've seen news reports that have been proven to be debunked about prayer rugs found on on the border and stuff like that. So I'm going to assume, but please correct me if I'm wrong, it's not in any country's best interest, especially Mexico, to turn the blind eye to the people that are using that country as a transport to the United States.
I don't think Mexico has turned a blind eye. In fact, I mean, there are unconfirmed reports. I mean, not unconfirmed, unnamed reports of Mexico renditioning about 97 foreigners into the United States by the U.S. request. People who were not U.S. citizens who were apprehended in Mexico by U.S. request and sort of sent over to the United States before fear of terrorism. There has been no terrorist incursion into the United States known coming in from Mexico. There has been from Canada, and yet nobody's calling for a shutdown on the border with Canada, and not to mention by air. So yes, no, I think that's something Mexico takes very seriously, and I hope they continue to take it seriously.
Okay, and just with respect to just the proximity, I mean, we still see reports here in El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, had another bad weekend with respect to the drug war and the drug trade. So with respect to domestic policy, which, obviously affects, if nothing else, the perception of Mexico from the United States, what do you see in López Obrador's final term with respect to battling organized crime? Because the numbers of homicides, unfortunately, have not gone down. The allegations of corruption within law enforcement ranks have not, gone down. So I mean, it seems like this is, second verse, same as the first for folks that have been studying the U.S.-Mexico border with respect to the drug trade for decades.
I'm very pessimistic about that, Julian. I don't see much political will to step up to the challenge that organized crime represents in Mexico, or the drug trade. But it's now organized crime because it's not just drugs anymore. It's extortion, kidnapping, people trafficking, human trafficking. And we have seen the rate of homicides go up in this administration, and yet no willingness on the president's side to assume the responsibility that it entails. And then we see weird things, like he's going to say hello to El Chapo's mother, or he's capturing and then liberating Chapo's son. And that worries me. That worries me because, again,
or not filing charges against the defense secretary. I forget the title.
I'm going to put that in another category. Because I am not as convinced that there was a clear case as we were led to believe, or even for political reasons, if you will. And again, I do not know the case particularly, but I put it in another category. Okay. But there's just the outright organized crime, all these criminal groups that are running around in Mexico, and they're gaining territory. And it's very hard to get them out once they gain the territory. And this president has, or President López Obrador has this philosophy that what they need is love. That what they need is love, what they need is a hug, what they need is a little maternal shaming and say, no, bad boy, don't. And it sounds great. I just doubt it'll work. And while we find out, we will lose a lot of territory to them. And the fight against them will be much more complicated, and that will also make the relationship with the United States much more tense. You saw this law that was passed in Mexico outlawing U.S. agents operating in Mexico. Mm-hmm. That's problematic. Or the ones that do operate, they have to report everyone they talk to in Mexico to Gobernación, to the Mexican Interior Ministry. Well, of course, they're not going to do that for reasons just of security and safety and fear of leaks. So in essence, or the López Obrador administration is pushing us back to the way we were during maybe you remember the assassination of Kiki Camarena, which was probably the low point of Mexico-U.S. cooperation in drug interdiction. And the thing is, when you reach that point, both countries continue working and things continue, seeming normal, but all trust is broken between both countries. So things start breaking down, and there's no big pronouncement. I mean, there's no White House briefing. The president comes to the White House briefing room and says this big pronouncement on Mexico. That doesn't happen. It's just an erosion of trust, an erosion on the way that two countries work. And before you know it, you don't recognize a bilateral relationship anymore. There are huge lines at the border because the truck and merchandise can't go back and forth because there's no trust, and that's not good. So I am worried about that aspect.
Okay, and last question for you before we get to the questions that have been sent to me so far. Let's combine the two countries. What's the relationship between Mexico and China, and how much is the United States keeping an eye on that independent relationship?
So I would say that the guiding principle on the relationship between Mexico and China is one of ignorance. And by ignorance, I mean Mexicans, one, there's no big pro-China lobby in Mexico, mostly because we've been displaced by China. When China joined the WTO in 2001, the number one displaced country out of the US market was Mexico. We are both manufacturing, exporting powerhouses. We are Coke and Pepsi. We are Marriott and Hilton. We, Ford or General Motors, one or the other. So there is not, however, there is always this ignorance or hubris between incoming leaders, not only in Mexico, mostly around the world, in which they have this period of hubris of saying, oh no, I can handle the Chinese. I'll reason with them. I'll have them see my way. And it usually takes them 1 or 2 years to find out that there was no accomplishing that. And China makes a lot of inroads in those 2 years. And that's the way China conducts a lot of its international relations with most countries around the world, is they use the 1-2 year period of hubris between incoming administrations. They advance, they gain yardage in those 1-2 years. Then the administrations realize there's nothing to be gotten from China. They freeze things. China stays put, waits for the next administration, and continues gaining yardage. In that sense, that's the one thing I like about López Obrador, is he never felt for that. He never fell for that. He right off from the beginning, he knew there was not much opportunity for Mexico with China. So right now there's not much going on between both countries, and that's how I hope it stays.
Right. One less thing to worry about from the north side.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. A couple questions so far. Could you speak to any nation's ability to do anything about criticize the current genocide being carried out in China? And the adjective on the genocide, I'm gonna butcher this name, so I'm gonna spell it. It's Uyghur.
So they're pronounced Uyghurs. Uyghurs.
Okay, right. So we've been talking about that. Yeah. And the second part of the follow-up to that is we have had students who have been directly impacted. It sounds like nations cannot raise flags about that without repercussions in light of your comments about Australia. Fair assessment from the...
Yes. So let me first, I think the Uyghur issue is one that countries will have to face with sooner than they imagine. So just yesterday, the Canadian Parliament voted unanimously condemning China for the Uyghur suppression campaign. This put Prime Minister Trudeau in a very uncomfortable situation, because basically his legislature voted unanimously to get itself ahead of where Trudeau was in condemning China. So sort of puts him in a tough situation. The Europeans are doing the same. So just as, for instance, Europeans just signed a mutual investment treaty with China, but the European Parliament is voting sort of by majority condemning the Uyghur issue. And you will start seeing this around the world. I mean, the fact is that this is, or the US has labeled it as genocide. The Biden administration, that was the last day of the Trump administration. The Biden administration has sort of said that they have no issue with that labeling, in fact, endorsing it. And that is what's happening. So any country wanting to overlook this will very quickly come to terms with the fact that, one, they will find themselves with mud in their faces because China will only be more brazen in the future. And if they do own up to it, and if they do act, then they risk the China market opportunity. So it's a huge issue. And going back to students' issues, so regardless of the situation of Uyghurs in the United States, I want to bring your attention specifically because we're talking in a university setting, the threat it represents for universities to have freedom of speech on China. So right now, 30% of foreign students in the United States are of Chinese origin. They come from China, not Chinese origin, Chinese citizens, which mostly who are great people. And unlike the vilification by the Trump administration, have nothing to do with spying or anything the like. They're here trying to get a good education, just like I did as a Mexican. I came to the United States to try to get a better education. The same with the Chinese. They're here, they're paying, and they're wanting to get a better education. Having said that, they do pay full tuition. I paid full tuition when I came here as a Mexican student to the United States. When you have 30% of foreign students paying full tuition, they are in essence bankrolling the US education system. So you have cases, for instance, when the University of California at San Diego invited the Dalai Lama to speak at their commencement. And of course, the Chinese government took issue. So it starts pressuring and controlling its students not to enroll at UCSD because they want to punish them for giving a voice to the Dalai Lama. And that's where you again see the Chinese government use its economic power to put pressure on academic freedoms that you took for granted. And you say, well, why not just overlook it? And then the university bursar tells you, well, actually, it does pay your salary and it does allow us to enroll all these other American students who otherwise would not be able to pay for their full tuition. They're being subsidized by foreign students, majoritively Chinese. So that puts you in an uncomfortable situation. And those are the things, again, and I want to be, Julian, extremely specific on this. No blame on the Chinese students. They are here like I was a Mexican trying to get a better education. Plenty of blame on their government.
Okay, yeah. And we talked about this probably more than a year ago when there was talk about cracking down from folks from China coming in. And you mentioned that as far as like how much they contribute with respect to tuition. Another question, how should Biden and the DOJ handle the abuses of so-called China initiative against Chinese American professors?
Warily. There's a lot of racism involved in that. And you see the numbers. And I believe 1 in 5 Chinese Americans accused or indicted are acquitted. Whereas for whites, it's 1 in 10. That means they are indicting more than they have full proof on. There's a journalist, Mara Fistendahl, out of Minneapolis. She wrote a fantastic book, which I strongly recommend. It's called The Scientist and the Spy. And she addresses all the ingrained racism on the law enforcement agencies against Asian Americans, particularly Chinese, and how they tend to target them more. So you bring this concern and hand it to the Trump administration, who likes to make everything a race issue, and it's just bound to become a huge problem. And I think that's what happened during the past administration with their whole of government approach, in which they started targeting every sort of Chinese American or Chinese academic in the United States. I hope the Biden administration takes a more thoughtful approach to that.
Okay. Going to alternate here. We got a Mexico question. As a result of the ongoing pandemic, Mexico has entered an economic recession and poverty has risen. How can foreign policy help Mexico recover? Again, going back to Mexico's nationalism and how much they depend on sort of foreign investment, it's a great question.
So it used to be that Mexico punched above its weight on foreign policy multilateral issues. So, I'll just give you an example. The Conference of the Parts on climate change was hosted by Mexico in, I believe, 2011, G20, 2013. Mexico was a country that was very good at building coalitions around bigger issues, whether they be climate change, whether they be finance, trade, on WTO. And with this administration, they have completely stopped doing that. They've sort of dismantled its entire multilateralist approach. And I think that puts Mexico at a disadvantage, because you do see a hoarding by the developed countries of the vaccines. Okay. 80% of vaccines are being, for all intents and purposes, being hoarded by developed countries. Not a single vaccine has come to Mexico from the United States, not one. Think about that. The vaccines we've gotten have come from China, have come from UK, Germany. There's a shipment coming in from Russia, not one from the United States. Now, usually, or before, Mexico was able to, through its foreign policy expertise apparatus and ability, form coalitions to put pressure and gain benefit to the Mexican population. In this case, for instance, to pressure the United States into releasing part of its supply to Mexico. The fact of the matter is that this president doesn't care about anything that happens outside of Mexico, so they have not done that. And that's why we are facing what we are facing today, which is an absence of vaccines and a rampant pandemic.
Okay. And my own follow-up. So in the last few days with the ice storm that crippled Texas, there was a lot of reports about Mexico not being able to get natural gas from Texas, which it usually does, which shuttered maquilas and things of that nature. So I mean, in that instance, it was every country, every state for its own, right? I mean, we have to take care of ours first now. So if other countries that contribute to Mexico had to suddenly just take care of themselves and shut off any aid or any cross-border commerce with Mexico, what would Mexico have to stand on its own?
Well, funny that you mentioned this, because you say every country for its own. Well, it just so happened that at the beginning of the pandemic, back in March, early April, because of the pandemic, Mexico closed much of its manufacturing sector to sort of send people home. Mm-hmm. And out came the U.S. ambassador to Mexico and the Undersecretary of Defense, Pentagon sourcing, saying you can't do that because of the supply chain. Because if you stop factories in Mexico, you are threatening our supply chains and our jobs in the United States. So hey, come on, and where's the solidarity? Where's the partnership? Come out and work and reopen your factories, even at the threat of infection, death, but do it for the partnership. And Mexico went along grumbling, okay, fine. But okay, at the end of the day, they reopened and he said, we're in this together. We're a partnership, the whole NAFTA, the US, Mexico, Canada, the supply chain. So it was not each country for its own. It was, we're one for all and all for one. And then this Texas thing happened. And Governor Abbott says, and Mexico depends 70% of its energy or its gas needs are sourced from Texas. 70% of gas means most of the energy in Mexico. So unilaterally, Governor Abbott says there can be no gas shipments outside of the state of Texas, shutting down all of the Mexican manufacturing in the north of Mexico. And I'm sure you saw it in Juarez, where across the border from New York. Yeah. And our reaction was, oh, weren't we one for all and all for one? Where's the U.S. solidarity? What about the supply chain? What about all these things you told us you needed us? Oh, well, you got to understand we're in a very difficult situation. The cold snap in Texas. I know we were in a difficult situation when we had COVID and you told us to come and open and risk our health for the sake of the supply chain. Where is the supply chain? So I think it was a low point. And I think it'll only embolden President López Obrador to seek energy independence, which is not convenient for any country, but it's something he believes in. So not a good place on that.
And I mean, I'm sure he knows as far as like the black and white policy, but is the gas issue from Texas, is it going to be AMLO versus Biden, or does he know to blame Abbott and not the entire country?
First of all, never assume they know. When you say, I know they know, it's like when President Trump kept saying that China is paying the tariffs. At first you laugh, at the end you say, maybe he did believe that China was paying the tariffs and not the US consumers. So does he blame Abbott or Biden? It's irrelevant. What he blames is every Mexican businessman or private sector who said we should have energy efficiency by importing cheap gas from Texas. Okay. And the fact of the matter is that there's no cheaper gas than the one that comes to Mexico from Texas. For 10 years, I mean, every day except one every 10 years, it supplies the cheapest gas and for the cleanest energy you can imagine. It's just one day that says, you see, we were wrong to put ourselves in their hands, and that's what he's blaming.
Okay. So Texas, United States, he sees them all as one. Excuse me. I like this question. Before we came on, I said that we appreciate the fact that you're so open. So this is a question from somebody viewing. Says, you frequently use Twitter, like many other politicians and other foreign ambassadors, to communicate with the masses. How do you see Twitter impacting the world of governmental and international affairs? We've seen what Twitter did the last 4.5 years, even before that, leading up to the 2016 presidential election. So it's here, whether you like it or not, it's there. It's an issue. You use it a lot. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I use Twitter a lot. I also have my Twitter book club. I read more than I tweet. I like to read a lot,
Sure.
and that's one thing. So there's now this new Clubhouse, and I'm new to it. I just opened my account yesterday, and I was dipping my toes in, and I was telling my wife yesterday, we were talking about it. I said the thing about Twitter and the thing about Clubhouse, it's too many takes and too little wisdom. That is to say, people go into Twitter and assume they understand an issue because they see tweets that make sense. But the fact of the matter is that to have wisdom or to fully understand something requires reading. It requires getting deep into issues. So I like Twitter. I take it as singing in the shower. I assume nobody's listening, and then every once in a while somebody says, "Hey, I read your tweet." I'm like, "I'm sorry, it wasn't meant for you." I thought I was talking to myself.
Right.
But I put a premium on reading over tweeting, and I like to ignore anyone doing anything, including President Trump, on his Twitter account. I just put no value on it. I think actions, words, wisdom speak louder than Twitter.
With respect to the policies, so we talked about freedom of the press and what China's doing to sort of clamp down on that to sort of prioritize its agenda. Twitter also banned former President Trump. So do you think that's good? I mean, even though you disagree with 99.9% of the things he says, do you think that was a good move?
I think it was a good move. And here's the difference. In China, the Chinese government banned Jack Ma, the owner of Alibaba, from social or from any public appearance for a while. In the US, it was Jack Dorsey who banned the president of the United States. And of course, the president of the United States has many venues to access people. So I think the fact that corporations have that power in democracy, individuals, I think it's something that we should cherish.
Okay. And lastly, we only have a few minutes left, but kind of something that ties into both countries. Both China and Mexico have been criticized for their production of illicit drugs, narcotics, transporting things that affect the United States. Is this where do you fall? Are those countries to blame, or are we to blame?
Yes. Yes, they are to blame. China in particular. But I'll give you an example very quickly that I used before with you, Julian, in Austin. So China exports most of the methamphetamines, most of the precursors with which methamphetamines are produced, and it's a huge market. But it's legal in China. So when you ask them to stop, they say, "Well, we can't. It's legal for us, So it's a customs issue for you." And of course, an American would say, "Well, that's outrageous. That's killing our communities. What do they mean it's illegal?" And as a Mexican, I will tell you, it's our same issue with guns in Mexico. We say, "Please stop," and the U.S. side says, "Well, they're legal for us. It's an issue for your customs authorities." So that's where the world has to come together. But it's a huge issue. Yes, it's mostly coming to China, Chinese government, and its lack of action is to blame.
Okay, great. Well, folks, we're about a minute away from 3 p.m. So a virtual bow in front of the crowd. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. It's always great catching up. Hope we do this again in the future. Time goes by very quickly. That means it's always a good conversation. So thank you, and thank you to the university for having us back. Hopefully next year under better circumstances and better weather, we'll do it in person.
Absolutely. Thank you both for participating. This has been a truly engaging conversation, and I really appreciate the thought you put into it. And I really do hope that we can get you both back on campus in a very short amount of time, so that invitation will stand, and we'll pursue you and get you back up here.
Thank you.
I would like to remind the audience that you will have, when the webinar ends, there will be a pop-up for you to complete an evaluation. If you could please do that. And also this has been recorded, and the recording you can share the word if you thought this was great, but someone who couldn't attend, will be made available both on our YouTube as well as on our website sometime next week. So again, Ambassador and Mr. Aguilar, thank you so much for participating in our keynote today.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you all very much.